Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Before we open things up to the listeners, Owen Smith, I want to ask you one question about the news that's broken since we've been on the air, the resignation of Keith Vaz from the Home Affairs Select Committee chairmanship. Jeremy Corbyn said that what he was accused of doing was a private matter, but he's clearly concluded otherwise. What's your reaction?
Well, I think Keith has done the right thing in resigning as the chair of the committee. I don't think he could have continued in that role, and I think I'm pleased that he's done what I think we all expected he would do and has stood down.
Right, let's take our first caller, Lee Chadwick from Harrogate.
You support spending many billions of pounds on new Trident submarines, so under what type of circumstance would you actually launch them?
Well, a pretty good one to go in on, Owen Smith.
Well, Lee, I'm someone who believes in multilateral disarmament. I want the entire world to disarm, which is where the big difference comes between me and Jeremy, if you like. Jeremy believes that the best way to do that is to unilaterally divest ourselves of our weapons and then use moral persuasion to ask the rest of the world to do that.
You obviously didn't understand.
I understood exactly, but I think it needs to be prefaced by an explanation of my view about nuclear weapons, because, obviously...
But it's a very... I can see that Mr. Chadwick is going to be impatient about this, and it was a very precise question. What are the circumstances under which you'd press the button?
Well, if Britain were under attack by nuclear powers, then obviously we would be prepared, and I would be prepared to deploy our nuclear deterrent.
Lee Chadwick, that was a very precise answer to your precise question. Are you happy with it?
It's not logical, because if we were under attack, then deterrence would have failed. And if deterrence is likely to fail, what's the point in having them in the first place?
Well, Lee, we've had a long-standing debate, haven't we, 60, 70 years of around the principle and the ideas of mutually assured destruction under nuclear, since the existence of nuclear weapons. I'm very clear that we have a nuclear deterrent in this country. If I were the Prime Minister and if I were the leader of the Labour Party, I would be prepared to use it. That's the principle under which we've operated since the Second World War, and I think it is unchanged.
Let me take another question now. Anne Shelburne from Carnforth in Lancashire.
Hello. Well, I'm disabled and I'm on disability benefits, and I wanted to ask Mr. Smith why he went along with Harriet Harman and various other Labour MPs who abstained against the Tory welfare bill, which allowed changes to welfare for disabled people, which has meant that hundreds of thousands of disabled people have lost their benefits and they've lost their Motability cards, and it's caused a lot of hardship and a lot of distress to disabled people. I want to know why he didn't vote against that, why he abstained.
Owen Smith?
Sure. Well, I've said many times to this, Anne, that it is one of the great regrets of my life that when I went into the Shadow Cabinet to discuss the welfare bill back almost a year ago, or just about a year ago this time, and I was one of three people in the Shadow Cabinet who argued that we should vote against that bill, but I was a member of the Shadow Cabinet, and the decision taken by Harriet as the leader of the party then, and therefore collectively binding us all in under the notion of collective responsibility, was to abstain. I think that was a mistake. I felt it was a mistake at the time. I was very pleased when Jeremy Corbyn asked me to become the Shadow Secretary of State for DWP, and I then reversed our position on it entirely and imposed the welfare bill at every stage, line by line, and tabled the amendments, of course, that won both the reversal of the PIP cuts, the personal independence cuts that were going to make life that much more difficult for people with disabilities, and, of course, the tax credit cuts. That was the right position for us to be in, and I was pleased to take us back to that position.
Anne Shelburne, I think you're planning to vote for Jeremy Corbyn. Has what you've just heard as an explanation and answer to your question, has that changed your view at all?
No, not at all, because if he'd done what Jeremy Corbyn did, which was vote against that bill, the whole thing would, he wouldn't be having to tinker about with, he was saying that he's always voted against since then, when the bill's been going through, it's just been tinkered with, but the whole core of the bill, if he'd voted against that in the beginning, we wouldn't be having to be transferred from disability living allowance to this new PIP benefit, which has meant that thousands of people have had their benefits cut off. He should have voted against it like Jeremy Corbyn did.
Well, perhaps I can come back on that. I agree that voting against it was actually the right thing to do. do. And as I said, I regret the fact that I abided by collective responsibility as part of the shadow government and abstained on it. Jeremy, of course, wasn't bound by collective responsibility and therefore was free to vote against it. However, the reality is, of course, if every Labour member had voted against the bill, as we did at every turn once I became the DWP secretary, we still wouldn't have been able to overturn the fundamental elements of the bill. And this is at the heart, I guess, of my contest with Jeremy, which is we can only really change these things. We can only do what I want to do, which is to scrap the work capability assessment, scrap the Department for DWP, which I think has become a byword for cruelty, and replace it with a proper department for social security and a proper department for labour, if we're in power. And therein lies the biggest challenge that I have to Jeremy, which is, voting against things in opposition doesn't ultimately achieve our objectives. You need to win power in order to do that.
Let's take another call from Edward Parker Humphreys in Lewisham.
Hi, Owen. I was wondering if you could explain why you think we need a second referendum in Europe, because I didn't want us to leave the EU, but I still think it's important that we acknowledge the majority of people did vote to leave, and I was just wondering how you reconcile those two things.
Go ahead.
Sure. Well, I do acknowledge that the majority voted. It was a narrow vote, but we did vote by a majority. My view is very simple. We still don't know exactly what we were getting. Theresa May says Brexit means Brexit. Well, that clearly isn't true. We were lied to about there being an extra £350 million a week for the NHS. That's not true. We were lied to about there being easy answers on immigration. Only yesterday, Theresa May effectively said it was impossible to introduce a points-based system. So my view is simple. We need to know exactly what Brexit is going to look like. Is it going to mean less money for the NHS? Is it going to mean lesser workers' rights, as was suggested by several Tories just in the last few days? And if so, we in the Labour Party should then call that out to the country, point out what Brexit actually means, and if it's worse, if it's lesser living standards, if it's more austerity, if it's more cuts, then we should have the courage to say we're better off being within the European Union. And either at a second referendum or indeed at a general election in which Labour was arguing to remain within the European Union, we put it back to people either to rubber stamp the deal and to leave, or to reject it once we know what the terms truly are.
Can I just pick you up on that? Because we won't really know the things you say we need to know until after the negotiations have taken place, and those won't begin until after we've triggered this famous Article 50. And by the time we've reached the end of them, it won't be up to us anymore, will it? It'll be up to the other European Union countries whether we stay or not.
Well,
so a referendum won't work.
I don't accept that premise, Ed. I don't think it's necessarily true that we can't engage in negotiation until Article 50 has been triggered.
Well, the Europeans have said we can't.
Well, some have and some haven't. And I heard the Tories briefing into the newspapers only 3 weeks ago that it might be 2019 before they triggered Article 50. So I assume they're not intending to not have any negotiations for the next 3 years and then wait to trigger it before they hold those negotiations. I think this is much more fluid than the Tories have suggested, and I'm absolutely confident that we should be negotiating right now and insisting on some clarity about what the nature of our terms of trade are going to be.
But we can't do that if the European Union won't talk to us, can we?
Well, as I say, I don't accept for a minute that we can't engage in those conversations. I think Theresa May has been engaging in those conversations just this last weekend, and I think we can come to a much greater degree of clarity about what it's going to mean before Article 50 is triggered.
So just to be absolutely clear about this, you see the sequence unfolding that we reach a point at which we have a pretty good idea what's involved in us leaving, and we then have a referendum before we, press the button.
Precisely right. I think it would be unbelievably unsatisfactory for this country to just drift out of Europe now without greater clarity, not least when we know the terms on which the referendum was fought, that there would be more money for the NHS, that we'd have better terms of trade. None of that stuff is coming to pass. Indeed, it's looking as though we will have worse terms of trade and we won't have extra money. We will have further austerity.
Edward Parker Humphreys, I apologise. I hijacked your question. Are you satisfied with the answer you got?
Yeah, I think he has actually kind of articulated a bit better, because I feel that some people were lied to about what Brexit actually meant. And I think if we can kind of convince people and show people that they deserve to have a say on what is actually happening in Brexit, that could be a policy that genuinely does improve democracy in the UK.
Another question now. Adrian Romilly, ringing from Tavistock in Devon.
Hello. Yes, I would like to ask you whether you recognise that the liberal values metropolitan values you espouse so fervently are not really shared by a great proportion of your traditional core vote, the working class, if you like, of this country. And therefore, your chance of making it to be Prime Minister are actually, I would say, less than those of Mr. Corbyn. You are a fervent espouser of liberal metropolitan values, and they are not shared by a lot of the traditional working class voters.
Before I ask Owen Smith to respond to that, can you give us an idea of one area in which you see that, one area in which you believe Mr. Owen espouses what you call metropolitan values?
Union, Mr. Owen passionately endorses, and we know that a great many of the Leave voters were working class voters. We also know that immigration is generally opposed by large numbers of working class voters, and yet I think Mr. Smith believes in those things. I could go on with other examples.
No, that's fine. Owen Smith.
Human rights, for example, would be another one.
Okay.
Well, I am definitely in favour of human rights. There's no doubt about that. Well, look, I don't recognise what you say, Adrian. I think I'm someone who represents a working class community, one where I grew up and where I still live and where my kids go to school and my wife teaches, and one in which I'm, deeply rooted. And I think that community wants a properly funded NHS. I think it wants proper social services in this country. It wants more investment. It wants to see a government that is interested in using the power of government to reindustrialise and make sure that there are proper job opportunities for local people. It wants to make sure that class sizes are adequate. It needs to make sure that people can afford to go to university or into FE or into a decent set of apprenticeships. And I'm proud that I've laid out during this contest, I think, a really comprehensive suite of policies on those areas. It's been called radical by some people. It's been called left-wing by others. I just think it's what's right for the country. And I don't think that's particularly liberal or metropolitan. I've never thought of myself as, maybe liberal, but not particularly metropolitan.
Wouldn't you not accept that the evidence suggests there is a gap between the leadership of the Labour Party and the views of many of its members? That's one of the things that came through the last election, isn't it?
Well, I don't think we connected with lots of people at the last election, but I think that is deeper than a concern just about Europe and immigration. And if I look at a map of the UK, I can see the areas that are ex-industrial areas where austerity is bit hardest, and where the cuts recently have certainly had the biggest impact. And you can overlay on that map the parts of Britain where UKIP has had greatest appeal. And I think what that tells me is that there is a clear, deep-seated economic set of problems in this country, people who feel that opportunities have been lost and that opportunities are perhaps only being enjoyed by others elsewhere. That does explain some of people's concerns about immigration, some of people's concerns about pressure on public services. And the answer to that is more investment. It's why I've said we need a British New Deal, a £200 billion investment programme in order to put money into schools and skills and hospitals and build houses and create job opportunities in the areas of Britain that are most under pressure.
All right, let's move on to a question which is not entirely unrelated to what we've just been discussing. Jane Gordon from Lancaster.
Hi, Mr. Smith. You've spoken actually just to callers there about taking collective responsibility for your decision making in the past. But like other voters, I like to see my MPs and people in Parliament taking personal responsibility from time to time. Do you take any personal responsibility at all for the current disarray of the Labour Party?
Yes, I think all of us in the Labour Party have to take some responsibility. I think we've been a weak opposition for not just the last 12 months, but for the last 6 years. And we failed to present the Labour Party as a credible, powerful opposition. And worse than that, we failed to present a prospectus to the country that the country can put faith in once more. And that's why we've got this contest, because many of us in the Labour Party are very worried that we face the prospect of another 10 years, a full generation, if you like, of the Tories being in power. Because, what I won't accept is the notion that we were doing swimmingly before the challenge to Jeremy Corbyn. We weren't. We were behind in 85 out of 89 polls, and we were only level in 4 polls, and we are now at the lowest level we've been since 1982. And that should be a wake-up call to us all in the movement, because that does raise the prospect of us having another lost generation, if you like, as I had as a young man in South Wales, where we weren't able to vote for a Labour government until I was 28 years old. I don't want to be 60 before I've got the prospect of seeing Labour back in power.
But would you not accept that a revolution against your own leader might contribute to the rather grim position you admit you find yourselves in?
Well, again, I didn't prompt that. I'm one of the people who only resigned on the Monday after I went to see Jeremy Corbyn and say to him, alongside 5 other of my colleagues who hadn't resigned, what are you going to do, Jeremy, to sort this problem out? Because we had those resignations, we had the prospect of a no-confidence vote in him. John McDonnell burst into that meeting, and I said to Jeremy and John, how are we going to resolve this? Because I think you want to split the Labour Party. Jeremy's answer to that was to say, well, I've got a mandate and it'll have to be a contest. John McDonnell's answer was to say that, to shrug his shoulders and say, if that's what it takes. And at that point, when I saw someone whom I think is on the hard left of the Labour Party and has an agenda saying he was prepared to see the party split, that's the moment at which I felt I needed to resign, and that is why I'm standing, in order to make sure the Labour Party survives as a viable alternative to the Tories.
I haven't got much longer, but can I put you a couple of emails that have come in? One from Stuart Murdoch, who says, I'd like Mr. Smith to give his assurance that despite his former employment for Amgen and Pfizer, that the NHS would be safe in his hands. And another from Mr. and Mrs. Wolfe, who puts the same point, I suppose, but rather more tartly perhaps. Please ask what prompted his transformation from private corporation lobbyist into anti-austerity radical socialist.
Well, I've had 3 big jobs before I came into politics, Ed. As you know, I was 10 years a BBC journalist. I was then 3 years working on the peace process in Northern Ireland as part of the UK government, and then I did 5 years working for 2 big companies, Pfizer and Amgen. And I think all of those things have given me valuable insights into how public and private sector work. But the fact that I work for companies that make medicines doesn't change in any sense the fact that I've always believed in an NHS completely free at the point of use, and I've always believed that the Labour Party that created the NHS must be its champion and remake it. That is why I've said that we need to spend an extra £60 billion on our NHS over the next 5 years, and I would do that by introducing 5 fair changes to taxation in order to credibly say how we would save our NHS in this generation, as Labour always has to.
Karen Barker has a call on exactly that point. Karen Barker.
Very precise, and I'd like a very precise answer, please, Owen.
Okay.
What percentage of GDP do you think should be put into the NHS annually?
Well, we should be getting up towards 10%, which is
so
the
10% is the figure you think we should be spending annually on the NHS as a percentage of GDP. Is that what you've said?
Let me answer.
Yeah,
when Labour came to power in 1996...
Never mind.
All right, Karen Barker, do you mind letting him finish, because he's trying to answer?
Jane, I want to make sure that our NHS is as good as it possibly can be. Jane, do you want...
I'll give him a chance, Karen.
Is what percentage of GDP do you stand
Karen
by
Barker,
should be into the NHS annually?
We got that. Do give him a chance.
I think we should be spending the European average at least, Jane. That's around 10 to 11% at the moment.
Are you happy with that?
No. What is the percentage?
I just said
10%.
10 to 11.
10%.
3 times.
Yes, it's pretty clearly.
Thank you very much.
All right, let's just now hear from a quick question from Bernadine Fenner.
Shumai, Owen. Earlier this year, you posted a tweet suggesting an ideal gift for Nicola Sturgeon would be a giant gobstopper. Even yesterday, you were defending this tweet as political banter.
All right, we've got little time. Quick answer to that, Owen Smith.
It was during an election contest. I was campaigning with a female Scottish colleague. Perhaps I shouldn't have done it.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. And we'll, of course, be granting the same courtesy of airtime to Jeremy Corbyn between now and the end of the campaign on the 21st of September.